Thank you very much for that round of floor speeches. Now, to our final round of paper speakers. I now call the final speaker for the proposition, Professor Octávio Ferraz. He is a Professor of Law at King's College London and co-director of the Transnational Law Institute. Before joining King's, he was a Senior Research Officer to the UN Special Rapporteur for the Right to Health. He previously practiced corporate and medical law in Brazil for over 10 years. You have the ears of the House.
Thank you, Mr. President and officer. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. As a first point of clarification, I must say that I am not in favor of mandatory vaccinations in all cases and under any circumstances. I am not sure if anyone is. I am also not in favor of mandatory vaccination whenever its imposition might lead to some important gain to public health. My position, to be clear, is this: mandatory vaccination is not, by necessity, a violation of human rights, such as the right to liberty or autonomy. It can be justified morally and legally under certain specific circumstances. It should not be the rule, but it should be possible to do it when we need it. So this was and continues to be my view, which I thought was rather uncontroversial, to be honest, until, of course, I saw the strong opposition to COVID mandatory vaccination schemes on principle. That is, automatically, as something that automatically violates liberty. That prompted me to write a piece with my colleagues at UCL, Jeff King and Andrew Jones, published in The Lancet in 2021. So most of what I say today here is developed in more detail there and in another longer document called The Legal, Constitutional and Ethical Principles for Mandatory Vaccination Requirements for COVID-19. So here is my argument. To claim that mandatory vaccination is always a violation of fundamental rights to liberty and autonomy, as some do, is to claim that these rights are absolute rights. That is, that they are rights that admit of no justified limitations whatsoever. Now, this is not, in my view, plausible. If that were the case, we would need to recognize other, even more implausible rights, such as a right to harm others, or even to kill others. So once we realize the absurdity of that proposition, and that the right to liberty or autonomy is not an absolute right, the crucial questions become three. One, under what circumstances these very important rights can be justifiably limited? Two, to what extent they can be limited? And three, what procedures should be followed to establish such limitations? Now, these are, of course, not easy questions, and there are perhaps no right answers to them, or at least no method to determine what the right answers are. All we can do is debate, put forward arguments, try to reach provisional consensus, which is exactly what we are doing here, I suppose. So I will offer my suggested answers to these questions in a moment. But before that, I would like to introduce an important concept which I borrowed from the American political and legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin, that some of you might know, who was my former professor at UCL, which I think is quite useful to help us think together through these questions. In his well-known book, Taking Rights Seriously, Dworkin discusses different meanings of the word right in moral discourse, and highlights one in particular, which he calls rights in the strong sense. By rights in the strong sense, he meant the following, and I quote, "In most cases, when we say that someone has a right to do something, we imply that it would be wrong to interfere with his doing it, or at least that some special grounds are needed to justify any interference." This is the important bit. Or at least that some special grounds are needed to justify any interference. The rights to liberty or autonomy are clearly rights in that strong sense, as we heard from previous speakers. That is, rights that demand the special grounds to be legitimately interfered with. I don't think many people disagree with that. We would now call this fundamental rights influenced by German constitutional law, or simply human rights, the terminology of international human rights law. It is absolutely appropriate, thus, as many have argued already, for those skeptical of vaccines to use the trump card of rights, another of Dworkin's phrases, rights as trumps that some might know, to insist that any mandatory scheme should overcome the high threshold that rights in the strong sense, human rights, fundamental rights, impose on any interference with them. What's wrong, in my view, is to regard any interference as an automatic violation of those rights. That, I emphasize, would imply wrongly that these rights are absolute when they are not. So what are, in my view, the conditions that any mandatory vaccination scheme has to fulfill to pass the test of justification? I can offer here only a sketch. Mandatory vaccination schemes must be prescribed by law and adopted only after extensive consultation, at least 4 to 6 weeks, with opportunity for wide participation of everyone. These consultations and government's response should be published before the passage of the law to allow for debates and amendments. Most importantly, mandatory vaccination schemes must also meet the principle of proportionality. The scheme must have a legitimate aim, that is, protection of life, reduction of transmission, protection of health services. The scheme must also be necessary, in the sense that there is no other less drastic means of achieving that aim. So we agree on that. Finally, it must strike a fair balance between the importance of the goal, protection of lives, and the burden it places on the individual. We wouldn't want to impose a mandatory vaccination scheme on a vaccine that only does a minor advantage to the health of the individual. We are talking about really serious diseases that have saved millions of lives, as we have already heard. So the proportionality test is not an easy one to pass, and it should be so, given the importance of the rights that are necessarily limited through mandatory vaccination schemes. And the same would go, I would say, for blood. In the middle of a war, when we have thousands of soldiers dying in need of blood, should we not make blood donation mandatory? So one final nod towards those who hesitate about mandatory vaccination schemes, and I think they have good points. And I'll try to do that via 2 brief stories from the early 20th century. The first, perhaps known to some of those who are here tonight, took place in Cambridge. Not Cambridge, England, Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the US. In 1902, after a bad wave of smallpox, the Board of Health in Cambridge, Massachusetts, established a compulsory vaccination scheme. Vaccinators went door to door to vaccinate people under the threat of a $5 fine, which was quite a significant amount in those times. A certain Mr. Jacobson and his son refused the jab, not on any abstract moral point of violation of their liberty, but on justified suspicion of the real intention of the American officials who were imposing it, who had the reputation of racism, sexism, classism, and xenophobia. Mr. Jacobson was a Swedish immigrant who suffered all of those harms. The second story happened almost at the same time in the early 20th century, but all the way down in the American continent, in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, which is incidentally where I come from. Also due to a wave of smallpox, which at that time was a big killer in the 19th and 20th century, luckily eradicated through vaccination, the Rio de Janeiro health authorities decided to impose vaccination, mandatory vaccination. But they targeted primarily the slums, which were inhabited mostly by the Afro-American communities of former enslaved people. For similar reasons to Mr. Jacobson in Cambridge, and not on principles of the right to liberty, many refused the jabs. And violent encounters with the police resulted in a large rebellion, known as the Vaccine Rebellion, Revolta da Vacina, with 24 deaths, tens of injured, and almost 1,000 imprisoned, which was the largest rebellion at that time in Brazil. So were these vaccination mandates justified on the grounds I defended above? Maybe not on participation and consultation, which at those times were really bad. Luckily, we have improved a lot on that. But I think certainly on proportionality, they were still justified. In the American story, the Supreme Court actually said so in their decision in Jacobson versus Massachusetts, 1905, cited to this date as the first precedent showing that mandatory vaccination schemes can be legitimately imposed despite interfering with liberty. But my point here is not to reinforce my case, which I think is strong enough, but rather to illustrate further precautions that, in my view, any mandatory vaccination scheme should adopt. And that gives credence to the arguments that were put by the opposition. Many people, like Jacobson, have a justified suspicion of mandatory vaccination, but not on abstract libertarian ideology, but rather bad past experiences in the encounters with the state. These are often religious, ethnic, and other minorities, migrants, foreigners, who already experience disadvantage and discrimination. So it's important to devise mandatory schemes in a way that reassure these individuals about the legitimate aims of the scheme and do not discriminate them further. I hope that most would agree with that. So to finish, mandatory vaccination, yes, sometimes, not all of the times, and with a lot of safeguards and precautions to make it legitimate and not reinforce vaccination hesitancy. Thank you.